stages of history of music in Medway. It generally covers a lot of the garage band stuff, the sort of Billy Childish sort of things that he's been up to ever since the late 70s. But there's lots of nuggets of other different things that have been quite interesting. And I thought I'd read to you today about some of the folky things that Medway is known for. So this is Chapter 9, A Medway Garland. It's generally considered bad form for a historian to insert him or herself into the story, and for good reason. The life story of Henry VIII is full enough of pomposity and self-importance without David Starkey adding his own biography to the mix. But perhaps now would be a good time to break with tradition. My first experience of live music in Medway was not of garage bands, jangly four-pieces or performances by tap and tin favourites. It was, instead, the slightly less well-amplified world of folk music. Had you asked me between 2008 and 2010, immigrant to the area that I am, how to describe the music that came from Medway, I would have said that whatever the past glories that the tap and tin had once boasted, they were now being upstaged by a vibrant folk movement. And as the pages up to this point hopefully show, I have since learned my lesson, and learned it very quickly. But at the time, it was very easy to make that sort of mistake. Didi Bergman, Wheels, Los Salvadores, The Flowing, and the Baron von Marlen could all conveniently fit in a box marked Medway folk. I'd also heard rumours about a band called the Singing Loins, beloved of local folkies, and Loop and Crook's support slot at a Bellowhead gig during the Sweeps Festival in 2012 had suggested a sympathy with folk at the very least. The Sweeps Festival itself would have helped in my argument, an annual gathering of Morris dancers waving handkerchiefs and bashing stick and stick through the streets of Rochester, their faces covered in soot as a tribute to chimney sweeps of old. It isn't, as some will undoubtedly assume, a misguided attempt to revive the fortunes of the black and white minstrel show. Medway's folk tradition goes back centuries. In 1881, Julia H.L. Devanes collected various poems and songs about Kent, including, of course, areas within Medway, for the Kentish Garland. It was in such a tome that The Chathamites, a song dating back to 1771, could be found. Over the course of 8 verses, it mocks the well-known town of Chatham, with its drunken soldiers and ship's crew and whores. Within a rather more enlightened age, the inclusion of Baptists, Methodists and Jews within this swarm makes for uncomfortable reading. In less anti-Semitic, anti-denominational verses, the song, to be performed to the tune of Nancy Dawson, compares the finery of Rochester and Strood with the home of the Chathamites. Proud Rochester and the Strood may talk of pavements smooth and roads of chalk, for those who choose to ride or walk, not so the folks of Chatham. Contented on their dirty hole, they hobble on with meaner soul, contriving how to save the coal, who would not live at Chatham. If anyone was to labour under the misapprehension that specific references to parts of the Medway towns was a preserve or even invention of the punk and garage bands of the 1970s and 80s, or indie acts of the 2000s, a perusal of the Kentish Garland would soon set them straight. These days, says Doug Hudson, who has been involved with the Medway folk movement since the 70s, if Billy Childish, Loop and Crook or Chris Broderick write a song about Medway Council doing something they shouldn't, you'll see a similar song from about 200 years ago about some dodgy politician. It's the same thing. During the period covered by this book, though, a parallel history of folk music was being played out in the Medway towns. While the likes of Billy Childish and Graham Day were busy with the revival of garage band rock and roll, folk clubs were a permanent fixture in the area. Medway had some great folk clubs, says Hudson. The first folk club was at Rochester's The Crown in the early 60s. It was run by the Medway Folk Trio when the likes of Bob Dylan and all that came on the scene. The folk club at Medway Little Theatre on Rochester's High Street came from that. That was a little folk club with my ex-wife Sue and I ran for a while. There was also the Medway Folk Centre that operated from the old ash tree on Chatham Hill. It used to get 2,000 to 3,000 people, says Hudson. It was a big, big thing, run by a bloke called Jeff Harden. Then, in the late 70s, some people moved to Medway and started another folk club called the Wish It Was a Brewery Folk Club, which was at Rochester's King's Head. The clubs proved massively popular, not least because of the big names they were able to attract. Even in the Medway Folk Centre's dying days, it was able to pull in a huge crowd, as the Chatham Standard's Alan Bennett, not that one, commented on the 6th of January 1976. The last time I went up there, I saw Peter Starstead, famous for Where Do You Go To, My Lovely, and the place was packed. Peter Starstead was just one of the famous folkies coming over. The Wish It Was a Brewery Folk Club played host, says Hudson, to Telephone Bill, John Martin and Richard Thompson. Meanwhile, Doug Hudson was also able to secure Ewan MacColl and Peggy Seeger to play at the Medway Little Theatre. They played a few times for us in the 70s, says Hudson. You'd always phone Ewan MacColl up and say, "Would you like to play the Medway Little Theatre? Is it a political thing?" he'd ask. "No." "Oh, it's £35 plus expenses." This was quite expensive in the early 70s, so I'd say, "What would it have been if it had been political then?" He'd say, "Oh, it'd be free." As long as it was the right politics, if it was a fundraiser for the Snowdon Colliers' welfare, they'd have done it for nothing.